Hello, bio class. Mr. Hartley coming to you from the middle of the Upper Rideau Lake at the moment. It's a beautiful day out here. Oh, no, I didn't say that you're here. My wife is hanging out here with me because it's gorgeous and we got away from our children. Our twins are old enough to babysit the little one, so we said fend for yourselves. Anyways, we are looking at the next part in our evolution unit, and this is speciation. So kind of how do we get these different species from the organisms that have the same, I don't know, ancestor. And so we'll kind of talk about this a little bit and how it could possibly happen. And so let us move on. First of all, what's a species? Well, it's any group of or population of creatures that can interbreed and produce viable offspring. This is under natural conditions. So a mule is not a species. A mule is produced from a horse and a donkey. They look similar, but when the mule is made, if it has a baby or tries to have a baby, it will not survive. And so mules are not actually a species. They're a hybrid. Same thing happens with fish. We have a creature around here called a splake, which is a cross between a speckled trout and a lake trout. And those two species are so dissimilar that, yes, they have offspring, but the splake cannot reproduce and have more splake. Okay, so a species reproduce and actually produce viable offspring that can produce their own offspring, and so on. So, how do we get these different species? Well, the first thing you have to realize, it only applies to creatures that reproduce sexually, because asexually reproducing creatures don't need a mate, so they're always going to be clones. So there's no changing in any genetics there. So that's the first thing. Now, what has to happen is you have to have something that isolates two populations so that they aren't going to reproduce in a long period of time. So this can either be, a big earthquake happened and the whole earth split apart, and so you've got two big areas that are completely different and separated by a big chasm and nothing can get there. Or it could be that, hey, these creatures prefer hanging out in these trees and these ones want to be in these ones, and so they just don't come into contact. So there are these different things that allow creatures to speciate, move apart. And of course, we have a few other things. So we have these pre-zygotic factors and post-zygotic factors. So a zygote, that's when, the egg and sperm come together. Well, some prevent that from happening, and others, it happens after. All right, so we're going to look at that. So the pre-zygotic barriers. So you can have the ecological isolation, like I talked about, where you have large space that prevents them from coming together. Good example is the groundhog and the marmot, which I have a picture of here. There's the two of them. Which is which? Good luck trying to figure it out. I could tell you, but that's because I found those pictures. But they look pretty similar, but these two cannot have viable offspring. So they are actually separated. One lives around in this area, the others live in the prairies. And so you don't actually have them coming in contact. Temporal isolation is a weird one because this is where you have the reproductive cycle actually occurs at different times. So this can happen with plants. So one plant will bloom, produce a flower at one time of year, the other one's at a different time, and so they just can't ever come in contact. Or it could be just other animals. I've seen this with flies, where flies will, one species of that particular type of fly breeds in the spring, the other one breeds in the fall. And so, again, they're not going to mate, even though technically they could, and they could produce viable offspring. They don't ever have that happen. Another one could be behavioral. So you have two different spiders that are considered different species, And the reason they don't ever actually have offspring together is because they have different mating rituals. So there's these funny ones that do little dances and shake their abdomen and wave and do all these weird little things. And if the ritual doesn't match, well, the female just goes up and eats the male. So they're not going to mate. Another one is mechanical, and this is kind of a bizarre one because there are people who do studies looking at the genitalia of ducks. I know. What kind of life is that? But it's kind of crazy because the genitalia of ducks are designed to only fit the female of their species. So as a result, they've got all these weird twists and turns, and they just don't work if it's with a different species of duck. And so obviously, mechanically, it's not going to work. And then finally, the last one, which is kind of bizarre, is one that happens with creatures who don't have internal fertilization, where the gametes don't match. And so the sperm and egg have to have certain markers for them to actually come together. And if they don't, well, it's just not going to happen for them. And so a good example is the giant clam. And no, giant clams don't eat people like they used to in the old movies that people thought, oh, it closed on someone and ate them. No, they actually move pretty slow, and they're just filter feeders. All right, the post-zygotic. So this is where the sperm and egg have come together, and what happens? Well, in some cases, literally the offspring that starts just dies. So the egg just dies and doesn't grow at all. The next one is where the hybrid is born, but it's not likely to survive. In other words, you've produced an offspring, it's been born, but it has some malformality or something that makes it so it can't actually survive to reproductive maturity. And then finally, the last one is the infertility, and that's the one I was talking about with the splake or the mule. Yeah, you've got offspring, it survives, it could possibly mate, but it's sterile. It's not going to have any way of producing young. So those are the post-zygotic barriers. And from here we get into the modes of speciation. So we have the allopatric speciation, which is the one where I talked about things are geographically isolated from one another. This even happens where humans build things in the way. So either we build an island and an animal goes and moves there, or we build a giant dam so things can't come in contact with each other. And as a result, you're going to have this one population of organisms which can't come in contact with the original parent offspring. And so they end up either finding new ways to feed or come up with their own mating rituals. And so as a result, they don't end up coming together. And so we consider them different species. Now, the other one is sympatric. And this is one which is kind of interesting. And you see this with the Galapagos finches, where it depends on food and competition for food. So if one is better at getting one specific type of food than the other, then the other has to either adapt or die. And so it's going to, in some cases, adapt so it can feed on something different, and eventually over time the two separate, and so they don't really come in contact. So that's the sympatric, so it doesn't require a big divide or anything separating the populations. All right, well, that's it for your lesson on speciation. Hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you around.